Welcome to Washington Watch with Congressman Walter Jones. Each month, we take a look at the events happening in Washington, D.C. and how they affect our lives here in eastern North Carolina. And now, here's your Congressman, Walter Jones.
Thank you. Welcome to the May edition of Washington Watch. I am pleased today to have Congressman John McHugh, who represents the 23rd District of New York. And Congressman McHugh has been in Congress since 1993. I have been in Congress since 1995, and I serve on the Armed Services Committee. I am very pleased to say that John McHugh is a very good friend of mine and a man I have great respect for because his knowledge on the issues facing our military, there's no one that knows any more, quite frankly, within the halls of the House of Representatives. And John has actually been out front in so many different ways, but one I want to mention because it's so important to the 3rd District of North Carolina, and that is personnel issues for our military and the families. John, welcome to the May edition of Washington Watch.
Walter, thank you so much. Thanks for those kind words. I'm not sure I can live up to them, but you're an honest man, and I'll try not to diminish your reputation.
Well, I appreciate that, and I should have said, John, that for the people back home, you're the ranking member on the Republican side. What that means to those of you that don't follow the Armed Services Committee, that John is the #1 ranking Republican. He is the ranking member, meaning that if the Republicans should ever take back the House of Representatives, then John would be the chairman, the full chairman of the Armed Services Committee. So being a ranking member is very, very important for this nation.
Well, once again, I appreciate that. You also failed to tell everybody, Walter, and I'm a little hurt. We're neighbors.
Well, that's true.
When we're here in the D.C. area, which we try to minimize. We like to get back home as much as possible, but we live in the same apartment building, so we get to see each other all the time.
You're exactly right. John and I live in Old Town, and from time to time we see each other. It's not that frequent, really, because we all have different hours and different times, it seems like, but John, I want again to, the issue of our military, and I wanted to bring this up because you've been overseas many times visiting, but in addition to that, I don't mind mentioning to you that many of my friends who are, as you have many friends, that are in high ranks in the military, both Army and Marine Corps, and certainly Navy and Air Force, but the build-up in Afghanistan, I've had many in the Marine Corps and some in the Army to say that men and women are stressed. They are going 3rd, 4th, and 5th times, and knowing of your interest and knowing again that you've been there many times to visit, and you've been there at the hearings as well, how do you feel about what the President's proposing?
Well, we all hope it works. There's a very delicate balance the President's put into play here, and nobody has been more active and involving themselves in the concern about the wide range of issues impacting our men and women in uniform and their families than you, Walter. And I know you appreciate that circumstance. And what we have found ourselves is calling on those brave men and women to pay a terrible price, one that frankly is being extracted from them because many in Congress, we didn't do our job well enough.
Right.
We took a procurement holiday, we took a defense holiday, we thought when the Soviet Union went away that all our challenges went away, and when September 11th hit, frankly, we weren't prepared. The amazing thing is how these men and women have continued to step forward. They're in these theaters for the love of their hearts. The volunteerism is just amazing, but we can't expect that to continue, and we sure, whether it continues or not, cannot inflict that kind of continued pain on their families, the children. You tell the moving story about the child who said, well, my daddy hasn't been killed yet.
Yeah.
That moved all of us at that committee so often. I think we've got to watch the stress on the force. We're in a period where we're building up the services across the board. We can't do that fast enough. That's the challenge that we face right now. And as for Afghanistan, I certainly hope we all can pull together and try to wish the President best in his endeavors, but it's going to be a tough slog. Tougher in some ways than Iraq.
John, why do you feel that NATO has not really stepped up, especially in Afghanistan?
You know, I've thought long and hard about this, and the failure of NATO, some of our NATO partners, too many of our NATO partners in Afghanistan to meet the challenges of what is legally, technically, a NATO mission is very troubling. It's troubling for what's going on in Afghanistan. It's troubling for what it means for the future of that alliance, it seems to me. And the question you ask is right on point. I think there's a variety of reasons. One is the politics of the individual nations. Some, even those that have sent troops, don't let them fight. Their rules of engagement are limited to very narrowly defined, non-combat kinds of activities. That takes away from our ability to go out there and do the best job we can. Others simply haven't supported it because they don't have the military capability. There's a requirement in the NATO Charter that each nation, each member nation, will support their military to an extent of their GDP. I don't believe there's a single NATO nation that has met that. Perhaps the Brits and a few others have, but by and large, they, as has been true since World War II, are living under the security blanket provided by the United States. So we've done that job. I think it's time to revisit NATO and to make sure we're going forward in the future that keeps it a relevant and an effective relationship, because right now it is not doing as well as all of us would like to see.
John, I really agree with your assessment, because again, as you mentioned just a moment ago, I'm just concerned that I hope that the new president has some type of benchmarks for what we're hoping to accomplish, because because of your position on the Armed Services Committee, probably even more than I do, that there's a real concern about Pakistan. And I'd like for you to share that with those who might be watching this show in the 3rd District, because I don't know if we were drawn into a fight in Pakistan with the circumstances as they are now, that might be just something that would be just really hard to fight, I guess, in a way.
Well, there's no question if we were to enter a ground war in Pakistan, the ramifications would be overwhelming. I'm not suggesting there wouldn't come a time when we absolutely would have to do that, but boy, it would be an incredibly tough fight and an incredibly dangerous one. I think that's part of the president's plan, to try to engage the Pakistanis in the military to do that work themselves. Recent press reports have been absolutely terrifying from my perspective. When you look at the advance of the Taliban eastward towards Islamabad, the Pakistan capital, they're within 100 miles of that critical metropolis. And if you go to the eastern, near the Indian border, there are Taliban elements walking the streets of Lahore, perhaps the most socially advanced city in all of Pakistan. And yet the Pakistani government, the Zardari government, seems to be, as I've described it, whistling past the graveyard, denying there's much of a challenge and that there's any threat to their nation. Now, I still think that it's unlikely that Pakistan will become a failed state, but if they do not become extraordinarily serious in very short order about the challenges that these extremist groups pose, not just to Afghanistan, but in fact to their own existence, we're facing a very frightening future.
John, I had a constituent this weekend at a social event actually brought it up to me. He said, well, you know, it looks like, of course, I understand that we want to try to keep as much distance between some of these countries as possible, but his point to me was that if by chance that the Pakistani government fails, which we hope it's not going to fail, and we should be more positive, but I got to ask this question, and he asked me, he said, well, then what's going to happen with India? Is India going to trust NATO? Is India going to trust America to try to bring some type of stability back to that country? I know we're talking, at least I am, not you necessarily, but talk a little bit out in the future. But, you know, these are some of the discussions. We've had hearings. Some of this has come up in hearings.
Well, we don't know the answer to that, and I'm not sure the Indians know what they would do. I have no doubt they've thought about it. I'm absolutely convinced they're concerned about it. And in fact, if you look at some of the Indian engagement in Afghanistan, the general thought is that is at least in part due to their concern about having a broader sphere of influence in case things do go very, very badly in Pakistan very, very quickly. I would hope as well, although like you, pray to God it never comes to existence, but I would hope our military is thinking about what we would do, particularly with respect to the nuclear arsenal in Pakistan, should that government fail and should Pakistan become a failed state. I doubt very seriously, and I really have no way of knowing, that the Indian strategy would be sit back and wait. Right. I think they would believe in their own self-interest. They'd have to take some kind of probably pretty dramatic action, but what that would be, as I said, I'm not sure they know as yet, but regardless, it would not be a happy time for any country on the face of the earth.
It really would be a very, very difficult time for the world. John, let me switch gears just briefly, but you and I, being Republicans, have been very, very concerned about the growing debt of this nation. The fact we're what's called a debt of nation. This happened under President George Bush, and now under President Obama, he continues to spend and spend. Well, recently, Secretary Gates, who I think we all have a great deal of respect for, he came out with kind of a budget proposal of what he thought needed to be done to revamp, reshape, to have a new direction for the military. Can you speak about that?
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with your observation. We're very fortunate to have such a great leader like Secretary Gates. He did a great job under President Bush in very difficult circumstances, and I think this administration, President Obama's administration's wiser moves was to keep him on because of that faith and trust he has across the board. He's made some very, very tough decisions, and we're going to have a whole lot of very heated, spirited discussion ourselves about how right or wrong those were, and that's the way it should be. Sure. Congress, and particularly the House Armed Services Committee, as you know, should have a role and a voice in that process. But nevertheless, I think we've got to give them credit for recognizing there's a spending problem, for understanding, as I think most taxpayers would agree, that for all of our need to support a robust military and a robust military budget, we ought to spend every dollar as carefully as it is our own and do it judiciously. And he's really taken a no sacred cow approach. The one thing I want to ensure as we go forward is that we keep transparency in this system. We've had inappropriately, and we supported this in the Congress, and the Bush administration actively advanced it, a kind of two-part military budget. The base budget, the one that we do every year, and then the supplemental, the wartime supplemental. That works in the short term, but over the 7 and 8 years that we've been engaged in this conflict, it's not an appropriate way to lay out our finances. They're going to try to move that supplemental into the base. I think that's good, but we've got to make sure that as that happens, we're not using it as a cloak, as a disguise for inappropriate and harmful defense budget cuts. So I think Secretary Gates has, as he properly should, set the table for us. Now it's our job, as the Constitution dictates, for us to kind of weed through it.
Well, I appreciate your analysis, because I agree with you. I mean, Secretary Gates certainly came in at a very difficult time after Secretary Rumsfeld was terminated, I guess is a proper word to say, or asked to resign.
He left.
Probably, yeah, he left. He left, that's right. But my thinking is that, you know, I have Camp Lejeune Marine Base in the district, Cherry Point Marine Air Station, Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, and not in my district, but certainly we have Fort Bragg Army Base in Fayetteville, North Carolina, but that's not in my district. But it seems like that after the last round of BRAC, that the bases in North Carolina have come out pretty well. As you know, you were part of raising the limit to increase the number of Marines that could be in the Marine Force, and so many of those are going to be coming down to Camp Lejeune. The process has already started. The one thing that I think that you and I have agreed upon, because you are the former chairman of the Subcommittee on Military Personnel, and that is the defense schools. The need to have these schools. We have one at Camp Lejeune all the way up to the high school, and I think that under Secretary Gates, that he sees the value to the family of having those DOD, we call them Department of Defense schools, DOD schools. And I know you have been a strong supporter of the families, and I want to thank you for that as well.
Well, that's awful nice of you, Walter, but you know, sometimes the blind horse is led to the finish line by much brighter people. And, you know, the Personnel Subcommittee, and I know very well that you couldn't agree more with this, but it is, in my opinion, the absolute most important subcommittee in the House Armed Services Committee, because it takes care of the men and women in uniform. It takes care of the families. And the tragedy has always been, when I served as chairman, it's hard to get members to serve on it.
Right.
And the reason being in part because, well, you know, these weapons platforms and these ships and bombs, those things are obviously important, but the men and women are the ones that keep this military strong. And I want your viewers to understand, Walter Jones never had to be asked to serve on that committee. He was one of the few people who stepped forward year after year and picked it and volunteered. And God bless you for that. And I know the men and women in uniform and their families so appreciate your leadership as well.
Well, John, thank you for that. And you know, I see it. We even recently been working on a mother of a child, a Marine mother, has autism, and yet we don't have programs down at Camp Lejeune. I mean, they have programs, but we don't have the experts who would be in the Navy to help. And so, just like you and others, these are the things that probably the majority of the viewers watching this show today, they don't think about the fact that these Marine families are just like any family anywhere else in the civilian world, and you have some children that have special needs. And so there is a real responsibility on that committee. And again, thank you for your leadership. And now we have Susan Davis, who's a very fine person from California, and Joe Wilson is ranking member from South Carolina, who does a very fine job. And I know that in this trying time, and you said this just a few minutes ago when we started this interview, that the families are being asked to do more than probably they have in the last 20 years, truthfully. And those families are having to carry the load of a loved one going back 3, 4, and 5 times. And PTSD, along with the TBI, traumatic brain injury, are going to be something that we're going to really have to deal with in this Congress, but also in the Congresses of the future.
Yeah, we've come a long way, but we have so much further to go, both in terms of providing the services, but also in recognizing it and changing the culture. And I know you understand this so clearly. There's still this feeling amongst men and women in uniform that somehow if you suffer a PTSD or you've got a traumatic brain injury, that's something you should hide from. We need to get this out of the shadows and treated more effectively. And I want to compliment you, and I don't know if your listeners are aware, you've introduced legislation that would require a review for those who are dishonorably discharged where perhaps PTSD or TBI played a part in that dishonorable discharge. These are illnesses as sure as any other illness is that you can give a shot for or some kind of antibiotic. And we cannot stigmatize those who go out and do the hard work of freedom and find themselves in that position where, by the way, RAND studies and others show about 20% of all the people coming back from Afghanistan, Iraq are suffering from one or more of those inflictions.
John, I think that RAND study you made reference to, it said possibly as many as 300,000. Yeah. And this study was done before we started to increase the numbers in Afghanistan. So, and thank you for mentioning that legislation. It's 1701, and I hope that the Armed Services Committee, your leadership, Mr. Skelton, will look at this seriously, because the numbers of those that are being discharged for less than honorable reasons left this going overseas to fight. They were fine soldiers or Marines. They come back and they've got a problem that they don't know how to deal with. So that's something we've got to work on.
Well, I'll try to do my part for you.
John, thank you very much. John, we've got just a few seconds left. I think I would just thank you for your leadership in the United States House of Representatives, your caring for the military, both active duty and retirees, and thank you for being on the show today. I appreciate it very much.
I enjoyed it, Walter. Always good to be with you.
Thank you. And in just a few minutes, actually a few seconds, Glenn Downs, my Chief of Staff, will be on the show, and we'll talk about maybe 1 or 2 issues that are we getting calls about or letters back from you, the people of the 3rd District. And if you will, bear with us just a few seconds, and in about 10 seconds, Glenn Downs, my Chief of Staff, will be on the show, and we'll talk about those letters and those phone calls, because you've been calling us and we want to answer those. John, thank you again for being on the show.
My pleasure.
Glenn, thank you for joining us again in the May edition, and I know you said you've gotten calls and letters, and we get them every day, but you might have 2 or 3 issues at the forefront.
Thank you very much for once again having me back here with you, Congressman, and a lot of the issues that you and Mr. McHugh were just speaking of are on the minds of the people of Eastern North Carolina, just because it's a very troubled world we live in now. You spoke of Pakistan. That's one thing people have been concerned about. They've read about the Taliban coming in and the whole issue of the Pakistani government having nuclear weapons. Is there another part of the world that you think people really ought to be focusing on that maybe is not on the front pages of the news today?
Well, Glenn, certainly you could mention Iran, and there could be North Korea, but you know, one of my biggest concerns really from a security standpoint is China. We're what's called a debtor nation. We owe the Chinese over $800 billion. And if you remember, and I know you do because we talked about it, about 10 days ago, one of the leaders of China said that we might, meaning we, the Chinese, we might stop buying the American debt. Well, you are somewhat of an expert on financial issues because you monitor that committee for me, and you and I both know that if the Chinese said we're not buying any more of America's debt, there could be a collapse. I am very concerned that we need to become less dependent on foreign governments to pay our bills. Now, that doesn't exactly deal with North Korea, which is a very unstable government, maybe some of the issues involving Iran, but really when you come back to it, I think that America's strength is the American people, and the American people have got to have jobs in this country so that we can rebuild America.
Well, there's certainly a great deal of frustration that I know you hear when you go back home, but also people in Eastern North Carolina, as I like to say, are never shy about expressing their opinions. Right. And so they'll call and email and fax all kinds of information and questions and concerns to your office. One of the ways that concern was really manifested itself was last month there were a number across Eastern North Carolina and across the country too, a number of these so-called tea parties where people went and really vented a lot of frustration and feeling about what did you observe on those days when this happened? Well,
Glenn, I think they were very active in Eastern North Carolina in both the 1st District and the 3rd District. We represent the 3rd District, as you know. I think it's good. I think, quite frankly, and I made this comment when we had Congressman McHugh on, that, you know, Mr. Bush was known as a spender, and now Mr. Obama is known as a spender. Well, the problem with spending, if you're having to borrow the money from foreign governments to spend, our children and grandchildren are not going to be able to afford the taxes the rate we're going. So I want to see the Congress and certainly the Senate as well to put slow down this spending, because we're not talking about millions anymore. Up here in Washington, we're talking about billions and trillions, and I'm hearing more trillions now than I'm hearing billions, and that's not a good sign.
Well, that's among the many things that people call your office about and express the same concern. That's one of them. 2 examples that people have talked about and you've had something to say about here recently is in terms of these spending programs. One was that Mr. Obama, after a meeting with some of his counterparts and around the world, has made a pledge to seek an additional funding of $100 billion, a little more than $100 billion, for the International Monetary Fund. And people want to know, well, if we don't have any money and we're borrowing money overseas, are we going to be borrowing money to spend money to send overseas? And how's that all going to work, they want to know.
Well, I'm of the firm belief, you and I both know Ron Paul very well, Congressman Paul. He's been on the show a couple of times, and I don't know how you can justify continuing to borrow so much money from foreign governments or printing new dollar bills. Because you and I both know the more that you print, as been said by you and others, when you're putting money into the market but nobody's earning it, eventually you're going to have tremendous inflation. So I think, quite frankly, that the new president needs to slow down the spending, and let's analyze over the next few weeks or maybe a few months of, is this spending doing any good to get the economy stimulated? I hope I'm wrong and he's right on this, but I just can't support this big spending because I know that there's going to come a day that we're going to have to pay it.
Well, people are very concerned about the spending that's already occurred and questioning how well has it been done, and particularly as it relates to these bailouts of firms, of picking some firms that are winners, big Wall Street firms that are winners, and other people that are going to be losers, and the like. And there have been some recent press reports about very troubling things about a big North Carolina-based institution, Bank of America, being potentially have been forced to do some things they wouldn't have ordinarily do. What's the story on that?
Glenn, I think I know the Attorney General of New York, Andrew Cuomo, has launched an investigation on Wall Street. And one of what came out last week was that Mr. Paulson and Dr. Bernanke had put pressure on Ken Lewis, that you just made reference to, that they needed, meaning Bank of America, to buy Merrill Lynch. And this, again, it appears that there was some type of inducement, and the inducement was, well, if you don't do it, we're not going to help you bank out. So we asked for an investigation by the Financial Services Committee, Mr. Frank and Ranking Member Backus, to look into what was done by Paulson and Bernanke, because I think it's got an odor to it, quite frankly. I smell a skunk somewhere in this thing, and we need to expose it if at all possible.
I know we're just about out of time, but one concern was that some of the bailout money that went to Bank of America to help buy Merrill Lynch ended up being spent on these performance and bonuses at this failing company, Merrill Lynch. And is that part of that odor you smell?
Well, it is, Glenn, because I think the taxpayers have a right to have sunshine on the spending of their money, and I'm with them 100% of the time. Thank you for watching the show, and God continue to bless our men and women in uniform. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to join us for Washington Watch.